Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me along. I'm Andrew Katz. I am a lawyer, although before that I was a software developer, but I've been advising on free and open source software for over 25 years now, quite scarily. And I've also been quite heavily involved in open hardware as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really talking about what do we mean by open hardware. And the first question is, do we call it open source hardware or open hardware? To be honest, I don't really care that much. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the licensing context. We're going to talk about some of the differences between licensing open hardware and open source software. And then we're going to delve a little bit further into the concept of open. What do we mean? Is there a distinction between openness in hardware and openness in software? And I really need to find some new terminology for this. So if anyone comes up with any ideas, then that would be really helpful. But there's a concept of softness in hardware. Some sorts of hardware are harder than other sorts of hardware. So we have soft hardware and we have hard hardware. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm a lawyer, so I tend to talk about things like liability, but don't worry, this one will be pretty quick. And then we'll talk about community dynamics. We all know that community dynamics are very important in the world of open source software. Do they work the same way in open hardware as they do in open source software? And then I'll talk a little bit about business models. Now, we've got a relatively small number of people here today. If you've got any questions while I'm going along, feel free to stop me, but obviously we'll have to make sure that we get a mic to you first because we're being streamed.
Do we have to say objection?
Yeah, it's overruled. It's overruled. So very, 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 very happy to do that. There's a lot to cover, and we've got a limited amount of time, and I do enjoy talking, so I'm going to have to try to summarize this. I'm not going to be able to go into any of these topics with the depth that I would ideally like to. So let's start with the question, what are we actually talking about here? This can be a problem because people come to open hardware with a preconception of what they're talking about, and it tends to be the particular field that they're in. Many people think about, when they're talking about open hardware, for example, they will think about electronics, so circuit boards. And, there's nothing wrong with that at all. More recently, you'll find people talking about silicon chips, open silicon. So, for example, the open hardware group, they're really only interested in open silicon, even though their name suggests that they cover the whole of the spectrum of open hardware. Then you can have sort of more physical items, so things like cases and racks and furniture to go in data centers. So that's the sort of thing that OCP, the Open Compute project, is interested in. And then, of course, you can have mechanical devices as well. You can have things like motors and engines, or you can have means of transport like cars and boats. And actually, the first piece of open hardware that I got involved with about 15 years ago was an open source car. You can have 3D artistic works. They can be physical, but they don't actually need to have any particular functionality about them. They can just be there because for aesthetic reasons. And any sort of 3D printed works, could potentially be open hardware as well. But they don't even have to be solid. I mean, there's no reason why fluids couldn't be open hardware as well. So you could be talking about a particular gas that you use for a refrigeration device, or you could be talking about hydraulic fluid, or you could be talking about a drink like cola. Open cola is a open hardware knockoff of Coca-Cola. So whenever I've been working on open hardware, and I've done a lot of work in licensing, I try to think of the whole potential spectrum of everything that we could be talking about in open hardware, not just one particular area like open silicon or circuit boards, for example. So when you're defining openness in terms of hardware, the Open Source Hardware Association has some guidelines, and they're based on the 4 freedoms, which, if you know free and open source software, you'll be familiar with those, and also the 10 OSI criteria for the open source definition. So the preamble to this says that open source hardware is hardware whose design is made publicly available, so anyone can study, modify, distribute, make, and sell the design or hardware based on that design. So anyone that's familiar with the 4 freedoms of the Free Software Foundation will see nothing peculiar about that at all. So here's an open question. I'm not going to answer it. Can a chocolate cake be open hardware? So is the recipe for the chocolate cake a design document? Right, just bear that in mind, and then we'll talk through this a little bit, because we're going to get onto the legal bit now. So open source software is very much protected by copyright. Software is protected by copyright, primarily. There are other intellectual property rights patents that are involved as well. Primarily when we're talking about open source licensing, we are talking about copyright licensing. And therefore, to do anything with any software, to modify it, or to run it, or to distribute it, or to sell it, make it available for sale, any of these things, you're going to need some sort of license under copyright. And that license can either be a proprietary license, like the sort of license that would come with a copy of Microsoft Word, or it could be a free and open source software license, for example, as with LibreOffice. Is the same true of hardware? Now, there are quite a lot of challenges as far as intellectual property is concerned when it comes to hardware, because potentially it's covered by a much broader range of intellectual property. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into this in any detail. So there may be copyright involved in the design itself, if it's a design drawing, for example. There could be patents. I mean, patents can apply to software, but they tend to be much more prevalent in the world of hardware. There are various other aspects, such as design rights. There's registered design rights, unregistered design rights. There's even sort of specific IP that is a sort of creature of statute that's designed for very specific areas. So there's things like plant breeders' rights, more specific to open hardware, probably. The semiconductor topography mask rights over the particular layout of a silicon chip. There's also database rights, which is a right particular to the EU and the UK. And the list goes on. So if you're looking at open hardware licensing, you need to think about a broader range of intellectual property rights than maybe people generally do when they're thinking of software. Now, anything that you do with software is likely to need a license. As I mentioned before, if you're running it, if you're modifying it, if you're distributing it, if you're making it available, all of these things would be an infringement of the copyright in the software unless you have a form of license. But with hardware, that's not necessarily the case. You know, if you pass a hammer on to somebody else, you don't need any form of IP license in order to do that. So a piece of hardware can be used and deployed very frequently in a way that doesn't involve intellectual property in the same way as it would with a piece of software. And this does have some implications from a licensing perspective. So bear that in mind. Now, if you're applying licenses to open hardware, what do people use? And if you imagine, the fundamental question is, what are you applying the license to? And the answer is, it is the design, which could be design drawings, or it could be a circuit board layout, or it could be the files that you need to create a bit stream for an FPGA, for example. So sort of Verilog code, something like that. I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth later. So when people are opening up hardware, they will be applying a license to it. And typically, they will start with the sort of licenses that would apply to open source software. So people have taken hardware and they've applied licenses such as BSD, MIT, Apache, and even GPL to their hardware designs in an attempt to open them up. Sometimes content licenses are used, so you'll be familiar with the Creative Commons suite of licenses. There are plenty of open hardware designs out there that are opened up by the application of a suitable Creative Commons license as well. But both of these types of license, they do have some shortcomings as far as open hardware is concerned. because they're not designed for open hardware. Open hardware has certain characteristics that are not the same as software. For example, many of these licenses in Apache, for example, GPL, they talk about source form and object form. Is it entirely clear what we mean by that in the world of open hardware? And they also tend to focus very much on copyright, and there may be some reference to patents in there. Apache has an explicit patent license in there. GPL does, depending on which version you're looking at. But because they're focused on software, they don't look at all of the other range of IP rights that I talked about earlier, so that can be a problem with them. Creative Commons licenses all explicitly exclude patent licensing, so no Creative Commons license will grant a patent license, so that can potentially be a problem as far as openness is concerned as well. So there's a number of hardware-specific licenses that are out there. I've worked with CERN to develop a suite of open hardware licenses, and that comes, like the Creative Commons, in a number of different flavors. There's a permissive version and weak and strong reciprocal versions, so they're sort of broadly supposed to be equivalent to Apache, GPL, and probably LGPL, but that's a sort of very, very broad description there. Solderpad is another license that I've written, which has been adopted by the Open Hardware Group, and that's very much based upon Apache, but just with some of the terminology tweaked a little bit so that it doesn't have this issue between trying to define source form and object form. And there's the TAPA license, and OCP have 2 licenses as well, although we can have an argument later about whether they actually count as fully open or not. But I won't go into the details of that now. So, open source licenses, they're not unlicensed. Something that's available under an open source license, it's still subject to a license, and there are some conditions. And those conditions, they can be very easy to comply with. So they can be just a question of retaining things like attributions and providing copies of license texts and so on, which don't cause any particular problems with implementation. It's very straightforward. Reciprocal, copyleft licenses, share-alike licenses, whatever you want to call them, they do create more of a problem because they have placed some sort of obligation on the licensee to make sure that when they redistribute whatever it is licensed to them, they also have to apply the same license. So the scope of that can be problematic, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the other issues is because you are always applying a license, the only way that you can make any of these obligations apply is through a condition to that license. And even if it's a simple condition like having to provide an attribution, the only way that you can enforce that is to say, unless you provide the attribution, then you're not licensed to do what you want to do with this particular design. Now, we've already established that in the world of hardware, intellectual property has fewer opportunities to impinge on what you're doing, and every opportunity to impinge on what you're doing is an opportunity to apply a condition, and therefore to make sure that these particular obligations stick. So that's one particular problem that you may have with open hardware, is there are not enough opportunities to make these obligations stick. And there is also a problem, particularly with these reciprocal type licenses, is how you deal with a combination of more than one component. So if you've got a particular component that's under a reciprocal open hardware license and you plug another component into it, does that mean that as soon as you plug the other component into it, that other component also has to have its design released under the same license? And that could apply to if you have an open source wheel and you bolt it onto a car. Does that mean that the whole of the car has to be released under an open source license? So this is something that is a challenge to actually define how that might work. So those are some challenges around licensing. There are also economic issues, and I'll go into those a little bit later. I probably won't have much time to go into them at all, so there's a link to an article. This will be published, but that does explain some of these issues in greater depth. The other question is, how open does open hardware have to be? So I've touched on the component point before. So if a component's design is released under open hardware, does that mean that you have to provide the design documents for everything to be created from scratch? And if you're thinking in terms of a circuit board, for example, it's quite easy to automatically visualize what you mean by a component, right? It's going to be a transistor or a capacitor or a resistor, or so on. This is not how things work with software. If you've got the full source code for a particular component, then you can compile the component, and if it contains any subcomponents, then they're also going to have to be appropriately licensed. There's no automatic cutoff point at which you say, these dependencies, you don't have to get a license for them. But of course, with open hardware, we're talking about a whole bunch of different types of open hardware. So how do you come up with a universal concept that says you only have to provide the design documents to a certain level of abstraction, and then below that level we can assume that these components are automatically available and you can acquire them from somewhere? So this is something else that we've been struggling. But then this impinges on the question of, if you don't provide all of those information about how to make the components, does that mean the design is truly open? So this is a much vaguer question in the world of hardware than it is in software. So in software, you can pretty much always claim that if the software is released as source code under a license which is approved by the OSI or the Free Software Foundation, then it's open source or free software, as the case may be, probably both. That's really as far as this goes. With hardware, the question is much more complex, and the Open Source Hardware Association goes further. So one, which is sort of obvious, but actually doesn't apply to software, is that the design must be made public in the first place. With open source software, that's not actually the case. It's perfectly possible for software to be, free software at least, if it's made available under the GPL and you just happen to pass that code privately to somebody else under the GPL license. It doesn't have to be made public. Of course, the recipient is perfectly entitled to do that if they want to. If you've had difficulty understanding some of the parts of GPL version 3, which I certainly did, the reason for some of this convoluted wording is quite often to allow this private distribution. But anyway, that's sort of by the by. So you also need to make sure that the interfaces to any software they must be documented or provided under an OSI license. So many items of hardware will contain software themselves in terms of firmware. So basically what it's saying is, ideally, all of the software is available under an open source license. If it isn't, then at the very least you must make sure that all of the interfaces are properly documented. And if you wanted to get it certified by the Open Source Hardware Association, they do certify designs, then you need to use open components where possible. So there's no prohibition on using proprietary components, but if possible, you have to use non-proprietary components. Right, okay, I'm going to talk very briefly about liability. Open source software licenses, they pretty much all of them will contain a very extensive disclaimer of liability in there. The same is the case of open hardware licenses. One question that some lawyers really don't like to tackle very much, because we're not sure we are going to like the answer, is how enforceable these disclaimers are. Most jurisdictions have some legislation that basically says blanket disclaimers, especially for certain things, covering such things like sort of death and personal injury. They're not automatically effective. There are good arguments why a judge might be prepared to say in this case they're fine, largely because you're getting the designs for free. So why should the developer suffer under any liability? But it's a potential legal debate there, and something that we need to think about. Certainly, we don't want individual developers to be found liable, because that would be dreadful. It would have a huge chilling effect on community involvement for any particular project. And you always have this complex interaction with regulation as well. I mean, fundamentally, consumers are entitled to receive safe products. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that statement. So that means somebody in the supply chain is going to have to carry the can. And the question is, who is that? And we just want to be very careful to make sure that it's not an individual developer. There is some corporate entity with sufficiently deep pockets or sufficient insurance who is able to who is able to accept liability. And of course, there are areas which are fairly heavily regulated as well, that only allow certain products to come onto the market if they have been through certifications or they meet certain standards and so on. That's particularly true of medical, pharmaceutical and automotive industries. So there is a tension between opening a design and allowing people access to it, and as much as they can, to reduce the friction, to enable them to participate in open development, but at the same time making sure that dangerous items are not released to the public. And so this is something else that is not settled, and there are a number of techniques that we're working on that may help to deal with that. But it does suggest a possible business model, which is where an organisation can release the designs for a particular project under an open license, but then at the same time say, okay, if you want to be the entity in the supply chain which makes it available, for example, as a medical device, then we will provide you with the dossiers, the information that is necessary to submit to the regulator to do that, and we can charge for that. So there's a possible business model there as well. So let's talk briefly about hardware and community, and this is where we get, yes, sorry, I have a question. Can we have a mic? So I'm sorry I'm going so quickly. So there is a large amount to cover here. So questions are welcome.
So just on the last slide, I suppose the question is: has anybody actually tested liability in court? Because that's the real test.
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
And it's very true of sort of open technologies on the whole, which in many ways is a good thing, is there are very few sort of court cases that we're aware of. Either A, because they tend not to happen in the first place, or B, because if they do happen, they're settled before you actually get to the stage of litigation. But there's been quite a lot of debate about it. Yeah. So I was involved in a European Commission study on the impact of open source software and hardware, which was published at the end of 2021. And we looked quite closely at the different sorts of open hardware and how they might be mapped. This is where the sort of soft to hard spectrum comes in. So I will just explain this cycle very quickly. So in any sort of development, you're going to have a design phase, which is where you design the thing that you want to make. Then you build it. If you're talking about software, that can be as simple as running it through your tool chain, compiling it, and then you test it. Does it work or not? If it doesn't, then you change it back to the design phase. So you get this cycle of design, build, test, design, build, test. When you're happy with it, then you'll go to a productize phase. And for software, that can be really simple. It can be just a question of making the binary available somewhere for people to download, or putting it part of some sort of package that they can put onto their system, and so on. If you're talking about something like a car, then the productize phase is obviously going to be dramatically more complicated. So this is one distinction that we have between software and hardware. So issues that we have with development, I mean, in software, the development tools are all in the digital domain. So things like GCC, the GNU Compiler Collection, they're generally free. They're free software themselves. They're available to anyone. So the barrier to entry is very, very low. You can develop very complex software on cheap equipment. As long as you've got an internet connection, you've got a basic PC, you've got Linux, you've got these tools, then you can really get involved in developing any open source software project. You can get involved with that if you want to. Hardware can be very, very different. So if you think about something like an open source car, I mean, first of all, you're going to need a whole bunch of CAD, CAM software. That's going to cost you a lot of money. There may be simulation software that you can use to do things like model the airflow if you're doing aerodynamic testing, or the effect of the suspension and so on. But I mean, that's likely to be extremely specialized, extremely expensive software. You're going to need a whole bunch of physical tools like lathes and milling machines and presses and goodness knows what else. Shipping a car around the world is a non-trivial activity. You're going to need a big space, and it's going to have to have environmental constraints. And that may include things like having ultra clean air, for example, particular temperature, and so on. And then, of course, there's much more variability in the cost and quality of feedstock that you could be using. There are many different grades of steel, for example. If you're building software, you're building it out of zeros and ones. Zeros are zeros, ones are ones. They're all the same. That's not the same with steel or lubricating oils or whatever you have. So there's big differences there as well. So if we go back to the sort of design, build, test cycle again, what you can try to do is, rather than having to actually build a car every time you want to test it, to a certain extent, there are, as mentioned before, there are some sorts of software that you can use to simulate various aspects of it. But there's no software yet that will let you simulate an entire car so that you know that this thing is going to work, and then you can send it off to some magic 3D printer that can use loads of different materials at once and create the car. That's not going to happen. So even though there are some sorts of open hardware where you can do an awful lot of the design entirely in the digital domain, that's by no means universal. Now, we were talking about an open source car, for example, but some sorts of hardware project, it's much more like operating purely in the digital domain. It's much more like developing software. So for those of you who are not familiar with FPGAs, they're a sort of chip called a field programmable gate array. And basically what you can do is you can reconfigure it to be a whole bunch of gates that can fulfill all sorts of different functions. It depends on the configuration, and I'm deliberately avoiding using the word programming here, although people often do, because that's going to confuse things. But what it's doing, you can actually change it into a different chip, effectively. It can be a processor, it can become a memory array, it can be a USB interface, whatever the configuration is that you feed into it. And the way that you create that configuration is by writing code that looks very much like software code in a language like Verilog, and then feeding it through a tool chain, and then it turns it into a bit stream, which is basically what the string of bits that you feed into the chip, and that configures it to do what you want to do. So is it hardware? Yes, but it's very much more like software. A lot of the development process is very similar to the software development process. And this is typically what I will call soft hardware, because pretty much everything that you want to do with that chip, you can actually do it in this cycle, in the build, test, design, and then you can simulate it, and when you're happy with the way it simulates it, and you can simulate all sorts of physical characteristics, you can simulate the timings, you can simulate voltages on the various pins, etc. That's all possible entirely in the digital domain on your desktop, and then you can productize it by plugging it into the FPGA. So it's much more similar to a software development process than it is to developing hardware. So to that extent, hardwareness does matter. And we found that hardware projects that operate much more completely in the digital domain have all of these very low barriers to entry, low friction. They operate much more like software projects in terms of the dynamics and in terms of the communities that are potentially built around them. And that's because you can use the same tools, GitHub and GitLab. And the one problem that we have at the moment is that a lot of the tools are proprietary and they can be very, very expensive. So an example of a company that's doing a really good job in terms of open source tool chains is Chipflow, but we've still got a fair way to go before that particular barrier to entry is removed. But nonetheless, we find that the dynamics that operate in this soft hardware world of open silicon are much more similar to open source software development than they are to other sorts of open hardware. Just to give you a background, so the cost to replicate a Linux kernel is 0. I mean, you just take the binary, copy it, and you've got another binary, right? It costs fractions of a penny to do that. The cost to replicate any car, even if it's an open source car, that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands at the very least, because you're going to have to completely remanufacture it. So this is part of the dynamics that come into effect when you're thinking about the economic impact of open hardware. But if you want to replicate an FPGA, then it's going to cost you, I mean, that's the cheap end, $1. But the cheapest FPGAs will cost $1. You just feed your open hardware bitstream into it, and it does exactly what you want it to do. Clearly, different FPGAs have different capabilities and so on. But that's, at the low end, it's $1. I mean, you're sort of talking about sort of $10, $15. You're talking about a pretty advanced FPGA there. So again, this is something that is much more similar to the software regime than it is to harder hardware like making a car. So what tends to happen is that soft hardware can be openly designed. And by that, I mean that because you can make the design available on GitHub, GitLab, you can develop a community around it, and they can have spent a few dollars on an FPGA test board. It's very inexpensive for them to be involved in the whole design and development process, much the same way as they would be if they were developing open source software. Hardware that is harder tends to be made on a release when ready basis. So this basically means, if we were, as part of the open source study, we were talking to Arduino, even though, those of you not familiar with Arduino, so it's a sort of little circuit board that's got a microcontroller on it, and you can basically use it to control 3D printers or heating systems, or it's just a very handy multi-purpose little device that you can program to do things and send signals and make things happen. And Arduino, all of their designs are open hardware, so there's no problem with taking the designs and manufacturing them yourself. People tend not to, because it's easier just to pay the relatively small amount of money just to buy an actual Arduino that's been certified by Arduino. But there isn't a community around designing the Arduinos themselves. All of that design is done in-house, and then when the product is ready, it's made available. Now, there's a huge community outside that of using Arduinos in various contexts and circumstances, but not actually in terms of the development of the underlying piece of hardware itself. So we found as part of the study that the most interesting and active areas in open hardware at the moment are those areas that can take advantage of all of the open source advantages that you have with software, the low barriers to entry, the low friction in terms of the development cycle, and so on. So the most active areas in open hardware currently are definitely in open silicon, because they can take advantage of these characteristics. So Sci5 is a good example, US company, which has received a total of $365.5 million in funding. And they produce processor cores, which are based on RISC-V. Swerve is an open source core that's been released by Western Digital. That's also doing pretty well. It's embedded in a lot of their sort of disk drives, for example. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other initiatives out there sort of releasing open silicon. So if you look across the whole swathe of open hardware, most of the activity at the moment is very much in the area of open silicon. And they're not just processors, cores, and interfaces. There are other open silicon activities going on there as well. So thinking in terms of business models, there is no one business model, but bear in mind that whenever you're selling hardware, there's also the possibility to sell atoms as well. If you're buying an Arduino, the chances are, you're not just going to take the design and make it yourself. What you're going to be doing is you will be actually buying the board. And Arduino's model is basically to sell its name and reputation. There are plenty of Arduino-compatible boards that are being developed using Arduino designs coming from the Far East, for example. That's entirely legitimate. But Arduino itself is not too concerned about them because they're relatively inexpensive anyway, and they believe that their name and reputation is why they still have very good ability to sell the hardware that they make. Sci-Fi sells enterprise versions of their cores, so there's open source versions of the cores, but then there's also enterprise designs for which you will have to purchase a special license that has additional capabilities as well. Western Digital uses its Swerve cores to build on foundational technologies. So we were talking about the chips inside the disk drives. And you can provide open hardware consultancy and training, and you can also sell a regulatory dossier as one possible business model. I sort of touched on that earlier. So, in summary, open source hardware is much less mature than open source software is. There are similarities between them, but there's also big differences, and we're waiting to see how that one plays out. Some of the basic definitions are not very easy to map from one area to another, so that's something else we need to be aware of. And the licensing situation is more complex in many ways, partially because there are many more intellectual property rights that can infringe on hardware. But the great advantage that we have is there are many fewer licenses. The number of dedicated open hardware licenses is pretty small compared with the hundreds of open source software licenses. That's a good thing. It's dangerous to assume that what automatically works in open source software works in open source hardware, but the softer the hardware is, the more likely it is that you can translate something from open source software to open source hardware. The physical world has much more of an impact with open source hardware, especially at the hard end. You're going to need factories and so on if you're making cars. And the only thing we do know is that we don't know very much, so we need to do significantly more study. So thank you very much indeed for listening to you. Appreciate your attention. Apologise for having to rush through that so quickly. Have we got time for any questions?
We've got time for 2 or 3 questions. Here, yeah.
There we go again. So are there stuff you actually just can't copyright or license? Because you used recipes as an example earlier.
Oh, the chocolate cake.
Yes.
Recipes themselves aren't copyrightable. It's the things that people put around them that are.
Yes, I should have. Yeah, that's one thing I sort of wanted to talk about that a little bit more. So, I mean, at its most basic, a recipe is a list of ingredients and an instructions on how you mix them together and how long you cook them for, and that in itself is unlikely to attract copyright because it is basically just a list of facts. It's like, if you want to make this chocolate cake, you've got to take these materials, combine them in this way, cook them for this long at this temperature, and so on and so forth. Copyright protects the expression of an idea. So if the recipe sort of says, this is my great aunt's recipe, and she used to, if we've read any recipe books recently, they all contain this extremely irritating waffle about about great aunt and chocolate cake. That's all copyrightable, which is cynically, you could argue that that's why it's in there in the first place. But if you can distill it into, what great aunt did was, she got this much flour, this much sugar, this much chocolate, mixed them up and bunged them in the oven, then that part of it isn't going to be copyrightable. And it does cause a problem because we have questions like if you have a sort of net list that you're using to generate a piece of electronics which sort of sets out, which bit of the capacitor goes to which resistor and sort of and so on. So it's that's a database. You can see it's a database. Is it subject to database right in the EU and the UK? Yeah, sort of not. So there are these sort of grey areas that we're not entirely sure about what is protected and therefore what the licenses can impinge on.
So Chocolate cake, no. Any other kind of cake?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi. I had a question about. I'm interested in the role of simulation, perhaps in facilitating sort of open source activity, because I think if you had a chip, say that people were interested in chip design or ASIC chip design, and they had a simulator which was, reasonably faithful that in the sense that if you put in a new design, it's going to tell you it would make a better chip. If you did embody it physically, you could imagine that the barrier to entry to get involved in that kind of thing would be quite low. But of course, then there's this sort of extra step. So I was just wondering. To me, the obvious thing that would be perhaps less ideal would be that the people wouldn't necessarily get the use of the better thing unless somebody was good enough to decide there's enough of a market to manufacture this chip sort of at a reasonable price.
Yeah.
But are there any examples of that where kind of they spin up these communities and they're designing things which just exist in their imaginations, or they would work on simulators, but then... Do you understand the question, or is it?
Yeah, no, I do very much so. And the trouble is, I'm not a chip designer. Yeah. So the answer to that, when I speak to engineers, and there's a question of how good simulators are in the first place, and obviously if they're pretty good, they're going to cost an absolute fortune and huge amounts of money. Yeah, exactly. If I talk to somebody and it turns out that they have a connection with one of the tool chain manufacturers, they're going to tell me that these simulators are absolutely superb and you can do absolutely everything in the digital domain, and you just press a button and some bits disappear over to China or Taiwan, probably, if you're talking about ASICs. And then depending on the current political situation, you'll get a box of several 100,000 chips back that will work perfectly. If I talk to people who are more used to putting chips together in the open hardware domain, they're going to basically say, no, it doesn't work like that, mate. Yeah. So it's a really good point. But the key assumption that we're not quite sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's inevitable that over time, these tools will get better, as they have done in the world of open source software. But maybe I'm being a little sort of over-optimistic in terms of thinking how long that's going to take to happen, because it's a very complicated issue.
Last question. The mic there in the back.
So there's a number of different licenses for open hardware.
Yeah.
Permissive, weakly copyleft, and strongly copyleft. Has any of this ever been tested in the court of law? I've not seen any.
Not as far as I know. No. This is a problem that we have, as mentioned earlier, behind that. The whole of sort of open technologies. We do have some open source software licenses that have been tested. But as far as I know, no open source hardware licenses.
So it's going to be a case of wait and see whether the copyleft, weak or strong, stands up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the legal effect is one thing. The other thing is, you're making a declaration about your intent is X by releasing something under a particular license. And I think they do have a normative effect on the basis that people will by and large, will try to comply with what you actually want. But yeah, it's entirely possible that could potentially be a lawsuit at some point.
Andy, why don't you give the microphone to the gentleman, and then Andrew, if you just let Tim set up, and then you can answer this question.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for your work on the CERN license, which I use quite a lot. There's a lot of talk about vaccines and medicines being openly licensed.
Yeah.
Is there anything that there are types of hardware in my mind.
Agreed. Yes.
Are there anything we can learn from that we can apply to, say, medical devices? We're making a lot of open hardware medical devices in disaster zones around the world.
Yes.
But the conversation seems to be very split between vaccines and pharmaceuticals and medical devices.
That's a really good question, and basically because you have another spectrum here, and one of the spectrum is with software, you don't really have to think about the externalities too much. Occasionally you have to think about sort of cryptography and export regulation and so on. But generally speaking, you get a bunch of source, pop it into a tool chain, something pops out the other end. That'll be subject to your open license. You can do what you want with it. Medical devices we sort of touched on earlier, or automotive. You have this extra layer of regulation, and you've got to figure out how you can make the regulation work with the openness. When you're talking about vaccines, then you're presumably an even more heavily regulated area. In the sense, once you've actually got, I work with a client who worked in drug discovery, and some of the molecules that they're working with are extremely simple, and you can sort of basically describe them in a little diagram and a formula, and sort of third of a page of A4 will fully describe what the molecule is, but the effort involved of getting it is where the value comes in. So I don't know sort of enough about sort of microbiology, whether that's necessarily the case with vaccines. But there's going to be an awful lot to actually make any use of this vaccine. You're going to need an awful lot of hinterland that is also going to have to be licensed in some sort of compatible open way. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks for all the questions.